So tonight we're going to be looking at what life was like for Americans living at home during World War II. And it was a little bit more of a substantial war for Americans than World War I was, because we were involved with it a lot longer, and of course we're going to see some of the really horrible things that were going on in Germany and kind of throughout Europe at the time period. So your guiding question tonight is, what was life like in the United States during World War II? So, of course, after Pearl Harbor, just like after you've seen lately, after the Boston bombings, after 9/11, there's going to be a lot of fear in the United States. Pearl Harbor is really going to show how much warfare has increased, how much more technology was involved during the wars. So things like the airplane really kind of closed down the war for a lot of us. It was super easy to get across the ocean. So, during World War I and during other time periods, it was a lot harder to go overseas. During World War II, we're going to start to see for the first time how easily accessible it is to fly overseas. So Americans are going to start to see danger everywhere. Fear was strongest, of course, along the Pacific coast. So Oregon and Washington and California are really going to be nervous about the potential of another attack. So a lot of people really began to be suspicious of the Japanese Americans, or the people that were living in, Japanese that were living in California along the West Coast. So we're going to start to see some really intense racism towards those Japanese citizens. In order to quiet those fears and to kind of ensure people that things were safe, Franklin Roosevelt is going to create these Japanese internment camps. And basically, they rounded up 120,000 Japanese Americans and put them in camps. Most of those camps were in Nevada, Arizona, places that were not necessarily the most comfortable places, but any way you cut it, forcing somebody to live somewhere else is really not the best thing in the world. Eventually, the United States is going to apologize for that time of history. A lot of people see that as one of the big stains on American history, is that Roosevelt was really stooping to a low level by interning those Japanese. So North Carolina, we know, is a very military-oriented state, and it was involved with World War II from the very beginning. The waters off of Cape Hatteras were called Torpedo Junction, mainly because there was a number of a number of German submarines that were spotted off of the coast of North Carolina. Hospitals were also set up in North Carolina for those victims that were coming back from the war, or the victims of some of the naval attacks that were going on. North Carolina had more military installations than almost any state in the country. This is when Fort Bragg is really going to start to amp up a lot. Millions of fighting troops trained at bases across the states, and a lot of Allied soldiers received some special training in North Carolina, so that officers' training was conducted in a lot of the different bases within North Carolina as well. So across the United States, and we talked about this in class, this boom in defense contracts, needing more defense weapons, needing more boats, needing more airplanes, parachutes, really is going to help the economy to come back after the Great Depression. $2 billion of the $10 billion of federal contracts were actually given to North Carolina specifically, so it was able to help us out of our depression in the state, for sure. Textile mills were a big part of it. They produced everything from bed sheets to parachutes for the troops. Factories and farms also mobilized for the war, canning food to send overseas, creating the lumber that was needed to build the barracks. Manufacturers that just typically would manufacture things that were needed for daily life converted from peacetime goods to things like rockets, cluster bombs, radar equipment. So they're going to really start to increase the use of this wartime technology. So nearly 1 million men and women helped to fill the defense contracts in North Carolina specifically. So moved into those defense industries. Just like in World War I, the women were used in those defense contracts. They were used into the defense industry. They worked alongside the men who were no longer able to fight in the war. They wore pants for the first time, which is still, of course, it's going to be the first time you see pants worn by women, and it's a huge fashion trend up even to this point. Americans are going to purchase war bonds, and we've talked about what war bonds were. Basically investing into the military in order to help fund the war, to make sure that, you know, the troops had everything that they needed. North Carolina alone is going to be able to purchase over a dozen airplane ambulances. Then we have ration books, which were distributed to deal with wartime shortages. So a lot of the goods that we take advantage of today were needed by the soldiers that were overseas. Things like leather for shoes and coffee and sugar all needed to be shipped to the troops overseas. So people were forced to kind of limit their consumption of those types of goods. So what rationing did was it ensured that every family received a fair share of those types of items. Shoes, gasoline, rubber, metal products, all of those things that were needed for those defense contracts were still needed, of course, on the home front, but more in limited amounts. People planted victory gardens, and victory gardens were used basically to grow the vegetables and then to be canned to shipped overseas, or it allowed Americans to eat those fresh fruits and vegetables instead of eating the canned vegetables. They also supported recycling drives. All of this helped to make sure that the troops were getting all of the goods that they needed to fight the war overseas. So keep all this stuff in mind for our discussion in class. The next video you're going to watch is going to talk about Americans' involvement in the actual war. So you're going to look at the troops that were fighting, the atomic bombs, things along those lines. So make sure you have detailed notes for class, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.